We'll take it from the top. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to NMCOG's Regional Clean Energy Workshop. My name is Daniela Garcia Moreno. I'm the Sustainability Planner with NMCOG. And NMCOG is a regional planning agency serving the towns of Billerica, Chelmsford, Dracut, Dunstable, Pepperell, Tewksbury, Tingsboro, Westford, and the city of Lowell. Today, I'm joined by Talia Fox, Sasha, Shyduroff, Francelis Morillo, Suarez. Talia is Sustainability Manager for the Town of Arlington, and Sasha and Francelis are both clean energy and climate planners with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. Throughout this workshop, we'll hear from each of our presenters on net zero planning and learning about how to go from inventory to implementation. We would love to know who else is in the room with us. So if you could take a few seconds to drop your name and your town in the chat, that would be great. And also, if everyone could mute themselves, and if you feel comfortable turning on your video so we can see who else is in the room with us, that would be awesome. Right, we have some people from Pepperell, Dracut, Westford and Carlisle, Groton, Chelmsford, Billerica. Okay, it seems like we have some pretty good representation from all the towns across the NMCOG region. So thank you all for joining us. I'm very excited for the content that we have to share with you today. And to give you a quick overview of the ground we're going to be covering, we'll start off with some basics in a brief Net Zero 101. Then we'll hear from Talia about climate planning and lessons learned from Arlington's Net Zero Action Plan. Then Sasha and Francelis will give us an overview on some of MAPC's climate planning resources, which are available to all of our communities. There will be opportunities for questions at the end of each of these presentations. And we'll close out with a discussion on some of the needs for assistance within the NMCOG region. So make sure to stick around so that you can share your own perspectives and what you've learned throughout this presentation. So to get us started thinking about climate change through net zero planning, we have a very special guest. This is Kelly Levin, an associate associate in the climate program, with the World Resources Institute, joining us via YouTube. She's going to answer the question, what is net zero? Can everyone hear that? Perfect.
Scorching heat waves, record wildfires, rising seas. These consequences of climate change are hitting us already and will do so much harder in the future. To avoid the worst climate impacts, global greenhouse gas emissions need to be slashed in half by 2030 and reach net zero around mid-century. The term net zero gets thrown around a lot these days, but what is it and how can we get there? Reaching net zero emissions requires us to do two things. First, we must reduce our emissions to as close to zero as possible, as quickly as possible. Phasing out coal, investing in clean energy, shifting to electric vehicles, protecting forests, and reducing food loss and waste are just a few ways to shrink our carbon footprint. Second, we need to pull just as much carbon out of the atmosphere as we pump into it. This can be done by planting trees, which absorb carbon into their trunks, limbs, and roots, as well as by deploying emerging technologies, such as direct air capture, which takes carbon out of the air and stores it in geological formations underground. A number of countries have already committed to reach net zero emissions by 2050, and some nations are even more ambitious. For example, Norway plans to reach net zero by 2030, and Finland by 2035. In 2020, all countries should put forward stronger national climate commitments that put us on a path to collectively reach net zero emissions by 2050. And in this process, they will ensure a bright future for our children and all life on Earth.
Thank you, Kelly. So that was, of course, I think an overview of something that you are all likely already aware of, that mitigating the effects of climate change is one of the greatest challenges of our time. And Of course, as Kelly highlighted, there are ambitious efforts being undertaken at an international, national, and state level, and all these policy decisions set the scene for the type of work that we have to do within our communities. Both the US and the Commonwealth have committed to achieving net zero by 2050, but these targets cannot be met without local contributions, which is where we all come in. So it can be more effective to work toward climate action at the community level rather than the state and national level. And net zero planning provides a framework for communities to do their part in achieving these collective climate goals. So net zero planning follows the process that you see outlined in this diagram. So first, communities start with conducting a greenhouse gas inventory, which allows them to identify, target, and measure the largest sources of greenhouse gases within their community. Then those involved in the planning process engage their communities to learn about their perspectives and to collaboratively identify strategies to address these emissions. And these strategies can take a variety of forms. They can address transportation, the built environment, or be more proactive and address zoning and clean energy supplies. Finally, stakeholders work together to identify specific goals and timelines that are necessary to achieve those goals. And our presenters today will dive more deeply into each of these categories and will equip you with some of the resources that are available and necessary to take on climate planning. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Talia for more information about climate planning and some of the lessons learned from Arlington's Net Zero Action Plan.
Thanks so much, Daniela. I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see my screen? All right, just get some thumbs up here. Okay, I see some nods, very good. All right, well, thank you all. My name is Talia Fox. I am the Sustainability Manager for the Town of Arlington, and it's a pleasure to be here today to share a little bit about net zero action planning in general, and also our particular experience here in Arlington. Just a bit about me. I'm an urban planner by trade, and I've been in this role for about a year now. So actually, I was not technically here for the development of our net zero action plan, but in my previous roles, I've done quite a bit of climate action and net zero action planning. I led processes in Wellesley and Watertown, Beverly and Salem, so a lot of communities in the greater Boston area. So I have some things to share from that as well. All right. So I thought we'd start with a quick Zoom poll, and I think Daniela is going to launch this in a moment, but I'm curious to understand from folks in the room here today, make it a little interactive. What stage is your community, either where you work or live, in the climate action and net zero action planning process? Take a minute. I think the poll was launched, but maybe you haven't thought about it yet, or you're just shopping it around with the relevant community boards, or you're starting that process soon. Maybe you're in the planning process, or perhaps you already have a plan like we do here, and you're just trying to get to work. So maybe we'll give it a few more seconds. Daniela, just let me know when we have critical mass here.
Yes, can everyone see the poll? Great. All right, don't be shy.
All right, I think, should we go ahead and close it and share the results?
I'm not seeing any participants yet. I'm
okay.
not sure if that is a glitch, or we could get a couple people to, I know some of our communities have started, so.
Okay.
Oh, okay, maybe I'm just not seeing the results.
Oh, there we go.
It seems
Yeah.
like people.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, there. I see. Okay, so we have a mix here.
Okay.
We have some folks about, let's see, like a quarter already have a plan, a quarter are currently in the planning process, and we have about almost a third only just starting to think about it. So we have a nice spread here. And yeah, I'll share some insights from different stages, I think, of the process to help everyone. Great. So I just want to take a step back and share some thoughts about why you might want to have a climate action plan or a net zero action plan. And I have climate in parentheses here because I think some of these reasons here are reasons you might want to make a plan in general for various things in your community, but you might want to set some goals or targets. That's maybe a more obvious reason to make a plan. Prioritize actions to achieve those targets. And you likely want to be in conversation with your community in order to identify what folks want to prioritize for those goals and targets. Sometimes climate action plans can be useful for accessing certain buckets of funding. That's not universally the case, but that can be the case. And then these last 2 points here are near and dear to my heart as a planner. I think the process itself of making a climate action plan can be very transformative, can build relationships and capacity, particularly if you want the implementation of your plan to be successful. That process going into the plan is very important. And then the last point here is something that I've found to be particularly useful in various communities where I've worked, that having a physical document to point to where leaders have signed on and said, we commit to these things, that can be really useful when going to a board or a committee, making a capital request or proposing a bylaw to say, we have this plan, we committed to this. So that's a reason we should move forward here. So a brief overview of our plan here in Arlington. It was published in 2021, endorsed by our select board, which is our highest executive body. The project that that we had to develop this plan was actually something initiated by MAPC, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, in collaboration with the city of Melrose and the town of Natick. So MAPC approached us and offered to apply for an executive office. It's a state executive office of energy and environmental affairs planning assistance grant. It's a good planning funding source. And they said, we want to do greenhouse gas inventories with a few communities and net zero action plans in order to inform a net zero playbook that we're creating. So MAPC approached us, we hopped on board thanks to some commitment from leadership that we already had. And that included a net zero by 2050 goal, which our select board had previously set in 2018. So we started with a greenhouse gas inventory, and we did our inventory for the year 2017. And MAPC later will get into some more details about how to go about this greenhouse gas inventory, but that inventory really informed our priorities. So like many residential communities in this area, most of our emissions are coming from buildings, followed by vehicles. And a lot of those emissions are specifically from residents. So in Arlington, approximately 80% of our greenhouse gas emissions are coming from residential buildings and passenger vehicles. And it's important to look, okay, where are these emissions actually coming from within these categories? So unsurprisingly, they're coming from fossil fuels, the direct combustion of fossil fuels in many cases. So in the case of vehicles, we're mostly burning gasoline in our cars here. And then in our homes, we're directly combusting natural gas and fuel oil to stay warm. And the residential fuel oil and natural gas emissions are about 2/3 of our total building energy emissions here in Arlington. You'll notice here that there are some emissions from electricity. And I mention this because I get a lot of questions about, well, what about the grid? The grid's not ready. And I think it's important to note that the grid is getting cleaner, and there are plans to strengthen the grid, make the grid more resilient, ensure there's sufficient capacity. And that is something that the state and many smart people at the regional level are working on. This image here is from the state's decarbonization roadmap. You can check that out at the link here, and I'm sure we'll circulate the slides after this. But if you want more details on sort of how that transition is going to happen, you can check that out. But it sort of speaks to the larger strategy here, which is that we want to reduce our energy use as much as possible. And then we want to electrify all of our fossil fuel powered systems. So the direct combustion I mentioned in homes and the direct combustion in vehicles, we want to shift those fossil fuel sources over to all electric systems and then ensure that the electricity is powered through local and regional clean energy. And that's how we're going to get to net zero. And that's the same strategy here that we have locally as well as at the state level. And if you were following my color scheme at all, you will see that the inventory directly informs our 3 chapters in our net zero action plan. So those 3 chapters are net zero buildings, zero emissions mobility, and clean energy supply. And within each of these categories, again, it's that strategy of efficiency plus electrification in the case of the buildings and mobility. So making our homes super efficient, weatherizing them, air sealing, et cetera, and then electrifying our heating and cooking. For vehicles, it's ensuring that we have alternatives to single occupancy vehicles, good pedestrian and bike access, and then electrifying any of the remaining transportation. And then, of course, ensuring that the grid is clean over time and producing renewable energy locally that can tap into the grid and store energy in times that it needs to be stored. All right, so a little bit about the process that we went through to develop our plan here. Briefly, here's the timeline that we had for the plan and some engagement activities we undertook. You'll notice that our plan started just around the turn of 2020, which is a sort of unfortunate time to be doing a community-based planning process. So we did our inventory in the fall of 2019, and then we're supposed to start a lot of that in-person engagement in the spring of 2020. That, for obvious reasons, didn't happen. So we had to pivot to a lot of virtual engagement. So we did a survey that was, got, I think, over 600 responses, which was great. And we did some focus groups. Those 2 things informed a first draft of our plan. We had a virtual public workshop and did some road shows. So presented the draft plan to lots of different boards and committees and organizations in town. We revised our plan and then had a final draft plan by the end of 2020. So just wanted to give that snapshot here of kind of this 1.5 year long process, which I would say from my experience is quick, but pretty typical, like 1.5 years. This is that net zero playbook that I mentioned that came out of the planning processes in these 3 communities. And the link to that is here. It's a really great resource that illustrates the different steps of the planning process. And I encourage folks to check it out. And what I'll do is I'll talk through some of the steps of this suggested process and share some insights from Arlington within each of those steps. So one of the key steps is recruiting support from your community. And here in Arlington, we are very lucky to have a pretty strong base of volunteers and a lot of dedicated folks who've been involved in climate efforts over the years. And that was really important to tap into for this planning process. So the flyer on the right that says "Be a Net Zero Hero," I think was pretty directly speaking to those folks who are kind of already in the know. And then my next point here about the usual and not so usual suspects is to make a point about trying to reach outside of that usual crowd. I think probably if you're doing climate planning in your community, you know who's going to show up at your meetings, or maybe you are one of those people who shows up at the climate meetings, and that's great. But it's, as I'll talk a little bit more about later, it's really important to be making connections to other topics that I think we all know here are related to climate, but that maybe aren't the first thing you might think about when you think about climate change. So another important step is to pursue commitment from your city or town leadership. And that in Arlington also, we were lucky to have that commitment already in many ways from our town manager and our planning department director. But it made it so that when MAPC did reach out to us, we were able to very quickly seize that opportunity. They reached out and said, "Do you want to participate in this grant?" And we said, "Well, great, we already have a committee that would be dedicated to developing and implementing this plan. We have a town manager who's on board, et cetera." So it was kind of a no-brainer for us. And so I think even if you're not already in the planning process, if you can lay that groundwork, I think it can help take advantage of those kinds of opportunities. Another important step is gathering the necessary information. So this is kind of the baseline setting process of your planning process. And that's to understand kind of where you're starting from. And so the greenhouse gas inventory is a big piece of this, but also understanding what existing plans you have is important here. So it's useful not to reinvent the wheel. We kind of know what we have to do when it comes to climate action. There's some pretty great actions and examples out there, and I would encourage everyone to leverage those examples. And here in Arlington, in fact, we had a planning process that was happening simultaneously for our Connect Arlington, our sustainable transportation plan. And so rather than do an entire other mobility section about pedestrian and bike access, we just said, oh, we have this plan. So one of the key priority actions in the Net Zero Action Plan is actually implementing the Connect Arlington plan. And this last point here, incorporate holistic planning, is more about the implementation phase. And it's a point about adaptability once that plan is in place. Yes, a plan might be a static document if it's a PDF, but certainly the things that go into that plan and the way that you're approaching your priorities, those are going to shift over time. And so you have to be able to adapt to changing conditions. Something here that happened in Arlington was a priority action in our Net Zero Action Plan was creating a fossil fuel ban. And as many of you know, that's something that other communities had tried to do, and then the state preempted it. And so obviously we couldn't do that. That was the action in our plan, but we couldn't exactly do it. We have to now follow what the state sort of pathway that the state is setting out for us. And that's going to require a lot of additional steps. So we had to pivot there. That's just an example of why adapting and adaptability is important after you make that plan. MAPC has a really great framework for equity, and equity is that lens that you really have to apply to every stage of the planning and implementation process. So I just want to elevate a few things from that framework, and I encourage everyone to check it out. The link's at the bottom here. Budgeting time and money. So doing outreach, incorporating the voices of folks who have historically and systematically been marginalized from public processes is important, and it also takes effort and time and money. And so as you're scoping your planning process, it's good to think about, okay, what are the things we're going to need to be able to do that effectively? So one example is thinking about paying members of your community who might not be otherwise able to participate in the planning process, paying them for their time, their expertise. It's important also to understand who in your community is going to be most affected by the actions in your plan. So that's probably going to require some sort of research or an equity audit of some degree, so that when you're designing your actions, you know, is it going to cost people money, and who is it going to cost money? So thinking about those things in advance. And then this last point it relates to something I mentioned earlier, which is how do you engage folks maybe outside of the usual suspects who show up at your climate meetings. And you can do that by making connections to the many interlocking crises that are present in our society today, right? Like climate change relates to public health. You can talk about gas stoves and how there's a lot of research now about indoor air quality. You can talk about how efficiency is an ability to save, or an opportunity to save people money, reducing their energy bills in this economy. You can talk about how climate change and increased density and transit access relates to affordable housing. So trying to make those connections, I think, can be really effective as a way of getting additional voices in the room. And I have a picture here of our table from our Net Zero Action Plan. We have this nifty action implementation table on the back of the plan. And every single action has an equity considerations piece. It's probably a little hard to read here, but for this action, which is about converting existing fossil fuel equipment to electric appliances, we have an equity consideration to target the outreach around that effort to renters, landlords, residents who speak languages other than English, low and moderate income residents, elderly residents. So just that's something that we have in our plan that I think is a way that we really implemented the equity piece here. Okay, I'll share a few lessons about implementation. So our plan is obviously a prioritized list of actions, but even from there, it's important that we just tackle a few things at a time. So I think once you have a plan, you'll have to be deciding, all right, what do we work on now? So we have an implementation working group within our Clean Energy Future Committee, which is implementing the plan. And that group periodically reevaluates what we're prioritizing in a given year. So we choose priorities based on a variety of factors, and those are listed here. So obviously there is the priority level with that the action is listed as in our plan. We have high priority and priority actions. So the high priority actions are obviously more important. And then we think about things like how much potential does this action have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or how much effort is this project or this action going to take, and how much bandwidth do the folks working on it have right now? Is there an opportunity for funding that's come up, or other strategic opportunity? Would something be a quick win, like just easy to go to a board meeting and say, we have this policy we want to propose, all right, check, we're done. It's never that simple, but you get the idea. And then, thinking about things like the resources and buy-in required, as well as competing at priorities. So right now in Arlington, we're trying to implement or adopt the specialized stretch energy code, and that's taking up a lot of time. And it is an action in our plan, but it means that certain other actions that we had been thinking about might have to take a backseat for a bit of time. And the images on the right are of some of the things we've prioritized in the last year, and I'm happy to talk about those if anybody has questions. All right, tracking and monitoring progress is important so you know how you're doing. And some communities I've seen have really great, very public-friendly trackers. Ours is an Excel table right now. So that's all to say, it doesn't have to be high tech necessarily. I do have aspirations to make a more public-friendly, public-facing tracker to show our progress, but for now it's as simple as this, so it doesn't have to necessarily be onerous. We are tracking metrics as well, and those metrics and tracking the success relative to metrics is kind of as good as the data you can find for those. So yeah, I don't have a ton of time to get into metrics or tracking, but I just wanted to mention that. Some high-level implementation tips that things I've found useful. Especially if you do have a lot of dedicated community members, it's great to empower them to take leadership on certain actions. So the way we've done this in Arlington is we have working groups for different actions, and each working group has a lead. So those folks on our committee are responsible for implementation of those actions. Here in Arlington, we have to plan around important dates. So we have a town meeting cycle, and preparation for that usually starts in the early fall for spring town meeting. And so just thinking ahead to some of those key dates or events in your community is important. This last thing, knowing when to say yes and no, is something I am personally working on, particularly as it pertains to grants. There is a lot of money out there right now for climate, and that's fantastic. And also it's just impossible to apply to all of the money for all of the funding opportunities. And then of course, once you get something, then you have to administer it, and that actually takes time. So just having conversations with relevant individuals to understand when to say yes and no to those opportunities is important. On the subject of funding, I wanted to share, and this actually was created in collaboration with some of the other presenters here, but there's a lot of different funding sources to leverage for planning efforts. This first one, the EEA Planning Assistance Grant, is the one that we used with MAPC. There's the MVP program, which is a state program, and that can be good if you have a resilience focus in your plan. There's other state grants like DOER's REPA grants, and then NMCOG has the district local technical assistance. And that's just state and regional. So then there's all of the federal money that we sort of are waiting to see shake out, and we don't know exactly what it's all going to look like. But for now, the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act, there's the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Grant Program. It's a mouthful, but possibly some of your communities are getting direct or have the opportunity to access direct allocations through that. And then there's a lot of EJ, or environmental justice programs at the federal level too. And we'll see lots more developed through the Inflation Reduction Act and the IIJA later down the line. Okay, this is just my final slide, some takeaways from what I've shared. Process matters. It's an educational opportunity and a chance to build community, to build capacity. Know who your allies are in your networks and when it might be strategic to tap into those networks. It's important even during the planning process, but also after you make the plan to be adaptable and flexible and adaptive, and pace yourself, as the former director of planning of our department liked to remind us. A plan is not a laundry list. you aren't going to be able to put everything that you want into your plan. You're going to have to prioritize, and that just means that you might not everybody's going to be happy all the time with the things that go in the plan, but you're going to do your best to collaborate with folks to make the strongest plan you can. And things that fall outside of that list, you might get to at some point, and that's okay. Making those connections with other issues to be able to tap into folks outside of the usual suspects, like in the fields of housing or public health. Those are really important to ensure that your plan is equitable. And then get creative with funding, tap into funding sources that are existing and that are coming down the pipe. And that's all I have. I'm happy to take some questions. Thanks for your time. And yeah, we'll leave it there. I also see there's some things in the chat, so I can take a look there. I just haven't been monitoring. I see Peter has a question. Can I share the slide deck? Yes, I'm happy to share that either probably through Daniela or others with NMCOG. Oh, okay, great. Stephen asked a question about outside of grants, did we fund a town budget line item to fund initiatives? So this varies. I would say, I believe there was a match required, a small match required for our planning grant, which I believe the town manager was able to find a bucket of funding outside of the planning department for that. And then it varies by initiative. We have some funds we have this, what's called a green repairs fund, which can be used for certain building initiatives, and we're able to tap into that. And that's sort of a standing small fund. But in general, we don't actually have a budget technically for climate here in Arlington. So we have to get a little creative. We were able to use ARPA funds, for example, for an electrification master plan that we did. So when I say get creative, like that's what I mean. Think about those connections. In that case, we were able to fund that plan with that money because we made a connection to air quality. So yeah, Peter asks, who are on our implementation teams, just committee members of the public? Both, combination of both. So the way it works is our Clean Energy Future Committee working groups have both members and members of committee members and members of the public. So it's a little bit of a case by case or action by action basis. We do get funding through green communities. Stephen asked that. And that's, on that cycle, those funds typically go directly to building projects, at least in Arlington. We've also used it for some electric vehicles, but yeah, I think I'll leave that there. Peter asks, have we found an easy way to do annual or biannual GHG inventory to track process? So this is an ongoing question. One thing that I actually did do recently was I have a partnership with Bentley University and some students there who are learning about greenhouse gas inventories. And so I'm working with a class there, and they are actually going to be helping us update our inventory. And that was an opportunity that MAPC actually alerted us to through their newsletter. So that's actually kind of interesting if you have students who are interested in learning about the greenhouse gas inventory process. MAPC's tools make it really easy to follow. And so we've been able to kind of do that in a mutually beneficial way. And then this last question, can we describe some of the progress Arlington has already made? Sure. So at least in the last year, well, I guess before that as well. So there are a few actions that we've done successfully. We launched this Electrify Arlington program this past summer, it actually tackles several actions in the plan, but it's basically a community-wide campaign to get folks to switch from fossil fuel powered systems in their homes and in their vehicles over to electric systems. So as part of that, we have a dedicated call line through some partners where folks can call up to get signed up for energy audits. We have a volunteer heat pump coaching program that I set up, which involves, so I took some funds from that Green Repairs Fund to be able to target at buildings, and we train some volunteers to be heat pump coaches in the community. And so those consultations are available for free for residents. They can get set up and talk to another resident who's converted to heat pumps in their home and do it themselves. And we have events through that program as well. So that's like one, I'd say, concrete example of an action or a series of actions that we've implemented in the last year. We also successfully increased the default percentage of additional clean energy in our community choice aggregation program. It was a mouthful, but for folks who are familiar with those kinds of programs, that just ensures that many more people in town can have an additional clean energy percentage in their energy supply in their electric bill. So I don't need to go on, I don't think, but that's the kind of progress we've made. It's, you know, it's kind of program by program and project by project. I don't see any other questions, but I'm sure it's time to switch to our other presenters anyway.
Yes, thank you so much, Talia. While we have funding on our mind, I just also wanted to add that NMCOG can utilize technical assistance funds to support our communities to pursue grants and help them apply for funding to achieve various climate goals. We have funding now for the next 18 months, and please feel free to reach out to me so we can follow up and find ways that we can support your community. And if you have additional questions for Talia, we'll have a little more time at the end after Sasha and Francelis' presentation. So stick around for that. And in the meantime, I'll hand it over to Sasha and Francelis, and they'll give us more information about the greenhouse gas inventory.
Great, thank you. I'm just getting my slides set up. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Sasha Shyduroff. I'm a senior clean energy and climate planner at MAPC, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. And I am joined by my colleague, Francelis, Morillo, Suarez, who's also on our clean energy team. And we're going to present today on the net zero playbook, but also more specifically on the greenhouse gas inventory tool and resources that we have. Just by way of background, MAPC is one of 13 regional planning agencies across the state of Massachusetts, and we work with 101 cities and towns in the greater Boston area. These are actually our sub-regions, so we have quite a wide range of communities. We, as a clean energy team, we provide a lot of services to the 101 communities around whether it's like technical assistance, policy and planning support. We also work on procurement support and then implementation of various clean energy and climate mitigation programs. And we've been working for quite some time on net zero and climate action planning. And as Talia mentioned, back in 2020, we worked on and released our net zero playbook, which we developed in process while we sort of were also working with the town of Arlington, city of Melrose, and town of Natick on their net zero action plans, so that this framework and playbook is really grounded in the best practices from here in Massachusetts, as well as best practices from across the country as well. So just to kind of give you a sense of the framework, this is all available on our website. We have a framework for action, which is what Talia walked through, sort of the step-by-step process of how to go about net zero planning. The framework for equity, which is around considerations for climate equity and racial and economic justice in our climate plans. So both best practices around community engagement and making sure that the planning process is accessible, but also ensuring that the strategies and actions also serve communities of color and low and moderate income communities, and that climate benefits and the clean transition to clean energy and net zero is benefiting all members of our communities. And then we have deep dive strategy chapters that really go into some of the example and sample strategies and actions that municipalities can really take to lower emissions. So there's a chapter on mobility and transportation, buildings, so both commercial and residential buildings, a chapter on zoning and permitting and sort of local policy, and then clean energy supply. In addition to developing the playbook during that project, we also developed our community greenhouse gas inventory tool, which you see here on the right. It is a Excel-based tool that is user-friendly and allows communities to go through a greenhouse gas inventory process. And we have a step-by-step guide that walks you through the process, so that if you're reasonably proficient in Excel, you can really just like walk through and do the tool on your own without having to necessarily pay for an expensive consultant to do the work for you. And so we're really excited. All of this is free and available to use on our website. And before Francelis gets into the tool itself, I'm just going to do some level setting on our greenhouse gas inventories 101. Many of you are probably familiar with greenhouse gases and also greenhouse gas inventories, but just want to make sure we're sort of all on the same page. So obviously, as we burn fossil fuels in our day-to-day lives, whether it's, driving our cars or heating, cooling buildings or producing energy, we emit greenhouse gases, which contribute to global climate change. When we think about a greenhouse gas inventory, we are trying to account for the emissions that result from a specific geographic area, whether it's a city or town, or in places where counties are more important, like counties or state levels within a given year, given time frame. Within a GHG inventory, the output is often communicated as equivalent CO2 equivalencies. So that allows us to kind of compare the emissions impact sort of apples to apples, but our primary greenhouse gases of concern include carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And then some of the global protocols, depending on emissions percentages, may also include PFCs, HFCs, sulfur hexafluoride, and nitrogen trifluoride. In terms of greenhouse gas inventory frameworks, our tool builds upon the guidance from the global protocol for community scale GHG emissions inventories, and is aligned with other existing tools and reporting services. So if your community is interested in doing GHG disclosures to the CDP, the results from our tool can help align with that. Similarly, if you're using ICLEI ClearPath, which has tools to set emission goals and tracking, our tool also aligns with and sort of uses the same framework as all of these other tools, so that there's real alignment between folks that are using the community-wide GHG inventory tool and using some of these other international tools. And just a note, so the global protocols that we used in developing our tool were developed by the World Resources Institute back in 2014 and updated in 2019. And it basically establishes a reporting requirement for community GHG inventories and helps provide guidance on quantifying these emissions so that there's consistency in how communities are tracking GHG inventories and how we're tracking carbon emissions, and making sure that there's consistency, transparency, and good data. And it also introduces the scopes framework for emissions, which I will get into in a second. So reporting levels, there are two reporting levels that for community level GHG inventories, the basic and basic plus. We focus our tool mostly on the basic, which include sources that most commonly incur and have publicly and readily available data. So you don't have to go through special studies to sort of find that data. And then the basic plus is everything that's in basic, and then also some more comprehensive inventories as well. So some of the sectors that are included in the basic include stationary and energy, so buildings, energy and industries, and sort of like construction. Transportation is on-road construction and railways, and waste, which includes municipal solid waste as well as the treatment of wastewater. There are other emissions that are tracked more in basic plus sectors, which include things like industrial processes and product use, agriculture, forestry, and other land use. And in terms of scopes, you may also hear scope 1 emissions, scope 2 emissions, scope 3, and just so that you're a little familiar with the language, scope 1 emissions are GHG emissions that originate within the geographic boundary of a municipality. And scope 3 are the ones that are emissions that occur outside of the geographic boundary, but are driven by activities within the region. And then scope 2 really is that interplay around grid supplied electricity. So this is a little bit of a visual. So oftentimes our tool includes like scope 1 emissions, some scope 3 emissions, particularly around like wastewater, and then some scope 2 as well. But we don't necessarily include all of the out of boundary like transportation or out of boundary transmission and distribution. And so I think that's it for the background on inventories, and hopefully as Francelis gets into our tool, some of this will also become a little bit clearer, because there's a lot of different sectors and a lot of ways to kind of capture that data. So I'm going to turn it over to Francelis to talk about our inventory tool.
Thanks, Sasha. So I'll run through a quick introduction of the tool. Since we don't have much time, I will give a higher level overview, but we'll be sure to share the recording to more comprehensive training that was done a few years back, so that you have that as an additional resource as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. So first, we want to note that MAPC worked with the consultant CNVGL to create the tool. They're a global consulting firm with an office in Medford, and they work on climate change planning services. And then here you can see the same map that Sasha had gone over for MAPC earlier. Next slide, please. So with regards to MAPC's project goals when creating the tool, these were the top 3. So we wanted to localize the tool to serve communities in Massachusetts. And this just allows like municipalities who have calculated their community-wide emissions with the tool to make comparisons between each other's emissions, since their methodologies would be the same. So Sasha was saying earlier, being able to do that like apple to apples. And we also wanted to make sure that the guide was comprehensive and that the tool was developed to be more accessible and an easier resource to use for this work than other inventories that might be out there. So our hope is that municipal staff or volunteers could work on their community inventory without having to worry so much about getting funding to do this work or capacity constraints. And then lastly, just have like a training for municipal staff and volunteers from communities who do this work and interact with the tool, which I had mentioned previously with that virtual training that we'll be sharing. Yeah, so the guide that Sasha briefly mentioned at the beginning includes extra resources, which are highlighted here. So there's a checklist to define local characteristics that will help communities see what kind of data they'll need to get to input into the inventory. So one example for this sheet is a checklist for a question about whether your community is served by the MBTA, another regional transportation authority, or if there are any municipally operated buses. So once you answer this question, for example, you'll know who you might need to reach out to or where you might need to go to like get this data. And then there's also the local data collection worksheet, and that can be used as a resource to compile all the information and data in one place before adding it into the inventory Excel spreadsheet. So you can also like notes here and save these documents so that anyone who might update the inventory in the future has access to all that information that was done previously. And then there's also the tool methodology template, which is actually Appendix A, I believe, in the step-by-step guide. And this is a great resource because it concisely explains like the methodology that inventory uses and can help the community answer questions the public might have about the inventory and the methodology used. And then there's also space in that document to document like the decisions made during the process on what data to collect and include in the inventory for your community specifically. So the tool itself, as I was saying before, is in an Excel spreadsheet with various tabs that you can toggle. And so the data is added to just one of the tabs, which is the inputs tab. Here it's displayed in this concept map as like the top folder. So you wouldn't have to worry about adding information to like the other ones in the beginning. And so this tab then communicates with the ones below and does the calculations like behind the scenes to develop the emissions data for the community for the three sectors, so stationary energy, transportation, and waste. And then the data from those separate sector tabs is also compiled into the all emission summary so that everything is all together. And various charts and graphs are created in the report charts tab so that there are some like auto-generated visuals available right away that can be used for showcasing and sharing that data for like community engagement, for example. And then here is a table showcasing the sectors and sources that are included in the tool. So as I noted before, the main sectors are stationary energy, transportation, and waste. And then there are subsectors tied to these. So for transportation, for example, that would be on-road vehicles and railways. And I won't go through it all, but the table also kind of details the specific emissions sources from those subsectors and then the type of energy used. So for example, for residential buildings, that would be like electricity or natural gas, heating oil, petroleum products. And then here, there are also some sources that you might have noticed aren't included in this inventory specifically. So such as emissions from agricultural activities, aviation, industrial waste, and off-road vehicles. And when the tool was first created, there weren't any good data sources to support finding the emissions these activities would be responsible for locally or good ways to estimate the data. So it was decided that these would be left out of the tool. And we used the global protocol principles that I'll talk about a little bit more after to kind of decide what sort of data should go into the tool or be left out. And I guess having said this, there are some optional sources that can be tracked if your community happens to have the data available. And so one example is obtaining data for like privately hauled waste, which is waste not collected by the municipality's waste service. So sometimes this is data a community has handy or is able to collect, but some other times it's data that is harder to collect, especially if it isn't being tracked every year. And so another example is getting data from regional transportation authorities, if applicable to your community, like if you aren't serviced by the MBTA. And so that can be included in the emissions coming from the transportation sector if you're able to collect that data from your regional RTA. So when getting started with the tool, the two big things are noting what year you are calculating the community-wide emissions for. So in this case, it's 2017, as that is the inventory's baseline year. And I guess as a side note, we haven't been able to update the tool to a later year because updating the inventory is dependent on the availability of more recent data from the Commonwealth's vehicle census. And so currently, like the latest vehicle census data available is from 2014, and there's no exact date for when the 2019 vehicle census data, which is currently being updated by Mass DOT, might be available. And so for now, the 2017 is still the tool's baseline year. And then the next thing to keep in mind, as Sasha was saying earlier, is knowing what your geographic boundary is for the inventory. And so for this tool, you would just select the municipality you are creating the inventory for. So some best practices for creating a local process for this work are listed here. So one of the things you want to do is make sure you identify someone that will be responsible for the inventory and any further updates to it. So whether that's a municipal staff member or volunteer from the community, it's important that someone is in charge of this work. And I would also say that it's good for one or two more people to know at least like the basics so that the institutional knowledge of the tool isn't gone when one person, in case like one person transitions out of their role. And then another important thing is to store all the files used and data collected in a central location, as well as any notes throughout the process on decisions made and such. So this will just help others to have access to the information and will make the process easier to replicate going forward. For example, if you have any updates to the inventory, especially if an individual who first worked on the inventory is no longer available to do so. And then it's also really important to log any changes made to the data and the methods. So for example, as I was saying earlier, if you have data from like a regional transportation authority, it'll be important to know how you calculated the data and any assumptions that might have been made. Since this is one of like the optional sources, the tool itself doesn't calculate those, doesn't do those calculations behind the scenes. And so it'll be good to note down how that was done for future iterations and just to make the process more seamless. And here are the global protocol data principles I mentioned earlier. So these kind of helped us decide whether a data source is robust enough to include in the inventory. We use these when deciding on data sources to use for the inventory, and communities going forward can go through these questions as well to help them with those decisions. All right, so I've gone through many resources tied to the tool itself. And here's, I guess, a quick step-by-step on how it might be helpful to go about using them. So I think one of the most helpful steps is to review the guide. It's very comprehensive before diving into the work, and then filling out the checklist to define local characteristics so that you can identify what data you need to get for your community and where you have to get it from. And then once that's been identified, you can use the data collection worksheet to have the data on one spot before you add it to the tool's inputs tab. And then remember also to use the methodology template to note the data collection decisions that were made throughout the process, so that's documented and available to others going forward. So I'll now turn back to Sasha, who will go through some example plans that have used the tool throughout their planning process.
Thanks, Francelis. Yeah, we just wanted to note, in addition to Town of Arlington and Talia's great example, just some other example plans, some of which have been completed recently, like the Town of Acton and Gloucester's Climate Action and Resilience Plan, which was a combined net zero and resilience plan to look at for examples. And then we also have some ongoing projects that at least the North Suffolk, which is a regional net zero plan with Revere, Winthrop, and Chelsea that we're working on right now. Many of these plans, or all of these plans, have used our GHG inventory tool as the basis for their inventory in the planning process. And also wanted to just reiterate some of the resources and guides that we have. So in addition to the step-by-step guide, we do have a more in-depth video training. It's about an hour long, but it goes through all of the different sections of data that you can add. And there's other resources on our website as well. And even though we're not in the same region, always happy to answer questions through clean energy at mapc.org, or to work with your RPA to answer questions that you might have about the tool itself. And that's it. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and catch up on the questions that are in the chat.
Yes, thank you so much. That was a great presentation. Yeah, we have a question from Andrew. The report we are working on includes mobility, building zoning, and supply. Where would we insert information like waste hauling in the report? If waste hauling is inbound, how would a town know it wasn't being tracked redundantly?
Andrew, maybe you could expand on that. The report, are you referring to your GHG inventory or more like your climate action plan more broadly?
So we've completed a GHG inventory, but only for local government, not for the community. So we didn't track the waste hauling in that sense. I heard Francelis speaking about it. And we do have a lot of private haulers. So if we measured all the private haulers, if we were able to do that, where would it go into this net zero report that we're working on? And then, okay, you know, if we were an inbound, if we were taking in that waste hauling, our town isn't, but somebody's taking our private hauling. You know, how do we know they're not measuring it as well? And now we've got duplicate data for what we're trying to reduce.
Yeah. So I think there's a little bit of nuance there, since you're talking about like a municipal net zero operations plan, or just sort of the GHG inventory just for municipal operations. And so if you're doing that through, like, are you doing that through MEI? Through Mass Energy Insight?
Yeah, so we used our MEI data. We worked with NMCOG to create the GHG inventory last spring, and we're now using that to create this sort of plan report going out. Yeah. But yeah, we use our MEI data extensively. Yeah, so MEI, I believe, doesn't include solid waste. It just includes like municipal wastewater, like pump stations. So waste is likely not being included in that municipal inventory. But if you were to, after doing the municipal inventory, do a community-wide inventory, then that's where you could build in like the solid waste information. I don't know, Francelis, if you have other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would say the same. I think in the GHG inventory tool, there's a section for including waste for the municipal service and also for private haulers for the total community. And usually we get that data from the Department of Public Works. They usually track that every year. And so I'd say, yeah, I'd say the same.
Yeah, and then if you have, some communities have done like recent waste audits, particularly if they're interested in doing like a zero waste or net zero waste plan. And so there is also an option to include additional data if you have it, if you've been able to do a waste audit. But if you haven't, most communities haven't. So the tool also has a way to just track that. Great. Someone said Westford has used the tool, which is great. I'd love to hear any feedback if you have any. And then, have you found any significant differences in the sources of GHG inventory in towns inventoried? We haven't been able to do like an extensive cross comparison. I think we do start to see differences between types of communities. So like a residential, so like for instance, in the regional plan we're doing with Revere, Chelsea, and Winthrop. Winthrop is a small, mostly residential community, and really sort of like a commuter community. And Chelsea has a lot of commercial and industrial. uses. So you do see that when you reflect it in the inventory in terms of that, like the percentage. So like Arlington is a very residential community as well. And we saw that passenger vehicles and residential buildings made up like 80% of the emissions. So you will see that reflected. One of the things that we do want to do at some point is kind of dig in, now that we have had more communities use the tool, to look at some of those trends as well, and differences. Any other questions? You can either put them in the chat or say them out loud. Okay, awesome. I will turn it back over to Daniela.
Wait a minute, I had a question. Have you found any significant differences between towns that have been inventoried?
Like significant differences? I think we just see like different trends based on their land use and things, but we haven't done like a deep analysis of it.
Okay.
Is there a second part to that question?
Well, I mean, it just seems that, you know, most of the towns are finding that their emissions are coming from transportation and buildings and the energy and the electricity that they're using. So I was just curious if there were, well, if you look at more rural town versus more urban, does that shift, you know, the pie chart somewhat in some way?
It does. It's interesting. So Sue from Westford just shared in the chat that they were surprised to learn that a third of the GHGs came from commercial and industrial. So you will see those differences based on how much commercial and industrial land uses you have. One thing that we would also like to do is to dig in more at like a per capita basis. We just haven't had the capacity to do that over, you know, the tool was released in like, we started using it in 2020. So really just the past few years. So we'll soon have, I think, enough communities to kind of look across different communities. But yeah, a lot of the, as Talia said, like we don't need to reinvent the wheel because a lot of the challenges are similar across communities. And so a lot of the solutions are going to be similar. And I think that's where it's useful in the community engagement process of like working with stakeholders, is to understand like how things might be different or what priorities you might have, or like identifying other challenges, or like the transportation and mobility challenges are going to be different too. So I think that's where, you know, the GHG gives us a snapshot, but when you start doing community engagement is where maybe you'll get into some more of those differences.
Awesome. Thank you so much again to our wonderful presenters. I think that was a lot of very useful information that I think all of the people in attendance, and as well as viewers watching the recording after, will be able to apply to some net zero planning activities within their own communities. Wanted to take the last 15 minutes or so to just open it up for a discussion on the kinds of regional needs or community needs that you see within your own towns for net zero planning. So really, this is just an opportunity for you all to share your experiences with net zero planning so far. If you've run into any challenges, whether there's certain resources available within your community that you're leveraging to take on this net zero planning process, or if you think that there's additional resources that your community needs to be able to achieve that. I think NMCOG is in a unique position in that, well, the NMCOG communities are in a unique position in that we're all at different stages of the planning process, as we saw from the poll earlier. So we definitely want to take advantage of this time together and share ideas and suggestions and comments with each other so that we can all advance and reach our goals. So I see that Andrew can ask another question. Can NMCOG or MAPC folks provide examples of how zoning can positively impact this process? Would either
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about zoning and permitting. So we do have a whole chapter on it, which goes through different examples of what we are calling climate smart zoning and permitting. So in addition to like land use policy, also thinking about building like the new stretch energy code and things like that. There are definitely ways in which the zoning code can either help promote climate mitigation and ways that it can also cause barriers. So like you can promote and lower barriers for solar by making sure that like rooftop solar is by right in all zones so that a homeowner can just get a quick permit to do that. You can also, things like transit-oriented development goals can really help reduce carbon emissions. There's a lot of examples on that. And then I don't know, Talia, if you want to talk about some of the work Arlington has done.
Sure. So we do have a couple of actions in our plan targeting zoning. Last year, actually, we did introduce a requirement for solar in certain circumstances through a particular development review process here. And that was done through our zoning code. So that's, an example. You could try to require solar specifically. We were also able to change our zoning bylaw to enable redevelopment on non-conforming lots that was more energy efficient. So we basically incentivized more efficient development, allowing folks to rebuild the foundation on a non-conforming lot. So that's like another example. I would say because of the new specialized stretch energy code, that kind of thing might be less or less relevant depending in a community going forward. If you're a stretch code community, the efficiency requirements are pretty stringent. So taking a look, I think, at the MAPC chapter that Sasha was referring to in that playbook would be really great for other ideas. I also know there's some good tools out there for climate resilient zoning, thinking about overlays for flood resilience and things like that. So lots of great examples of how zoning can support climate mitigation or resilience.
Yeah, some of the other trends we've seen are municipalities adopting solar canopy bylaws to allow for solar parking canopies. And yes, we are also working on our climate resilient land use. So we have a toolkit focuses a lot on like flooding and water. And I think over the coming year, we're hoping to add in more around extreme heat, and a lot of the solutions for extreme heat sort of pair well with energy efficiency solutions as well. So like cool, promoting cool roofs and things like that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, and thank you, Sasha and Francelis, for sending those resources over the chat. We'll make sure to share all those chapters along with the slides that were presented today. So you will have access to everything that has been shared and all this great information at your fingertips. Are there additional questions? I see that Charlotte has raised her hand. Charlotte, want to unmute?
Hi, yeah, sorry my camera's not working today. I hope it's okay for me to ask a question. Groton is not in NMCOG, as you know, Daniela, but thanks for letting me crash this anyway. My question is about what your perspective is on how towns integrate measurements of carbon sequestration. So for example, Groton is over 50% open space. And, we're working with the MAPC inventory tool to calculate emissions, but there's been a lot of discussion around calculating our sequestration. And I understand that the global protocols, there aren't really great set standard ways of doing that yet. That's my understanding. But regardless, let's say that they were, what is your perspective on that? And how would you use that?
Let's see, I think that's a great question. Yeah, our current tool doesn't necessarily look into that stuff. I think that going back to like the core principles of net zero, you still want to be reducing emissions as much as possible through energy efficiency and electrification. And that then sort of this perspective of reducing emissions as much as possible, and then netting out the remainder through your carbon capture methods or carbon storage. We have been working with a consultant last year to develop some tools around nature-based solutions. We haven't yet beta tested it yet. So if you're interested in beta testing it, we can certainly share that. We haven't released it more publicly yet because we just need some communities that want to try it out and to walk through the tool, make sure that there aren't any kinks in it.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely be interested in you know, talking more about it, because it's just something that it seems, you know, part of the community wants to at least acknowledge the work that's been done by, you know, the Conservation Commission and other, you know, land trusts and stuff to conserve land and the value of that. But at the same time, we don't want to give anybody a pass on reducing emissions. You know what I mean? It's, yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely follow up. I'll chat you my email and we can talk offline.
Awesome.
If I may add, I do one of the plans I worked on, which was for the town of Weston, Massachusetts. I believe they had a sequestration analysis, like an analysis of tree cover as part of their planning process. So it might be worth checking that plan out. So that would be the town of Weston. And I was just poking around and I found it in there. So it might be worth looking into that.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Tom, would you like to go ahead and you can ask your question?
Oh, yeah. Okay, thank you. I just wondered if you were aware that some towns are enforcing stricter setbacks on rooftop solar, you know, based on fire safety codes, such as requiring 3 feet of clearance at the top and on one side. And I mean, that can actually, you know, make a huge difference in how many panels could be put on a roof. So, you know, I mean, that, of course, safety is important, but I'm hoping that organizations like yours would try to push for, you know, towns not going overboard on this kind of restriction, and which could result in many fewer panels. And there also is, they should distinguish between a habitable structure and a non-habitable one. So it really does not make any sense to restrict the number of panels on a garage, say, versus a house. Any thoughts on that? Sorry for being long-winded.
No, thank you for your question. Not sure who would like to take this one on. Yeah.
I mean, I can talk a little bit too about it. So I think it's a little tricky because in Massachusetts, you know, as you know, the building code and fire code are adopted at the state level, and then local jurisdictions are in charge of enforcing it. So there are setbacks required in the fire code for rooftop solar. If your inspectional service department is going beyond what's in the code, they shouldn't be doing that. But there isn't a way, our zoning codes can't conflict with the building code. So there's no way to really have control over that.
I was gonna suggest that as well in our the zoning bylaw for solar, or requiring solar as part of our development review or environmental design review process. We just reference any requirements as part of the code. So
yeah, and those codes get updated every few years based on like the international code. So it's we do a lot of we have our like codes for climate program where we've done a lot of advocacy and worked with other advocacy organizations around improving our building and energy codes here in Massachusetts. But it's also like a slow and onerous process sometimes. So
I guess one thing I can add here is that the specialized stretch code, or well, I don't know if your community is a stretch code community already, but if your community is considering adopting the specialized stretch code, there are pretty robust solar requirements in place when there is a mixed fuel new building. So just like if you're concerned about solar development in general, promoting that the adoption of that specialized code could be a way to ensure that any new construction is maximizing solar.
yeah, where I guess local zoning code would hit in are like setbacks for ground mounted solar. So you want to make sure that those aren't too restrictive. But in terms of rooftop solar, that starts becoming more of the fire code and building code.
Great, thank you so much. I think Peter's hand was up next. Peter.
Thanks, Danielle. Hi, everybody. Peter, Town of Chelmsford. First of all, thank you, everybody, for this webinar. I've got a whole list of things to work on in our town's plan. Chelmsford is about in the middle of the process that's been outlined today. I have a question I hesitate to ask because it could be a long answer. So maybe I'll just point it out. And if there's anything super obvious in the time remaining, just shout it out. One thing we're working on is community outreach, right? Because, you know, to hit net zero, obviously, our citizens and business owners all have to take specific actions, and you can certainly drive that through zoning and incentives and whatnot. But at the end of the day, you really want people to understand what the goals are and what they can do. So we've been using a combination of different communication channels in our town. I don't think we're different than many towns. We do not have a central communication vehicle like the old days when there was a town newspaper. So we've been trying to chip away at things like the town manager newsletter, Facebook posts. We've had a couple of public meetings and so forth, you know, just a whole series of different things. But is there anything else that anybody has found helps in this day and age when, you know, people are getting their news and their information from many, many different sources, and it's kind of hard to even figure out how to reach everybody when you want to have a public meeting? Any thoughts in different towns, just very quickly? Big question. I'm sorry. We can table that for another session since it's getting late.
No, I think, yeah, go ahead, Talia.
I was going to say, we just did, we put a little buck slip, which is like a, you know, third of a page, 8.5 by 11 slip into our census mailer to advertise about our Electrify Arlington program and various energy efficiency initiatives and ways to reduce bills. So good old mail, depending, can be useful, especially if you can hop on board something that's already going to happen, then it won't cost additional money. But otherwise, I've just found, you know, attending in-person events as much as possible with key partners is really effective. But yeah, it's a real issue. You got to just sort of tap the channels you can in this day and age. But it sounds like you're doing a good job.
All right, well, thank you. I don't think there's an easy answer, just to chip away at it. Thank you.
I will say that people are super burnt out in general, kind of in this weird post-COVID, but not quite post-COVID world. And so trying to do some in-person stuff, hybrid stuff, meet people where they're at. But yeah, engagement in general, I think has been sort of up and down over the last few years.
Great, and Sue said we have found census and tax bills to be useful. Also working with your assessor's office could be a good way to make sure that you're reaching homeowners. And Francelis also said some communities work with community-based organizations to increase engagement. So if there's any like neighborhood associations or other community groups, definitely looping them in on your efforts would be a great way to increase your outreach. I think we'll have one last super quick question. Philip, would you want to go ahead and unmute?
I just wanted to make a comment based on the placement of solar panels and essentially how they relate to both zoning and building codes. Zoning and building codes are very much separate, as you've said, but they don't always reconcile with each other. They can actually be in conflict with each other. So you could in your zoning have placement of solar panels on roofs restricted if you wanted to on inhabited buildings or in uninhabited buildings. And the building code will only be referenced if there is solar panels and how the construction would be. So just be aware that there can be and often are some conflicts between zoning and building codes. And one other piece of information is that there are only 50 communities in Massachusetts that are not on the stretch energy code. So it's quite prevalent. And I think it's only 2 communities right now that have gone to the super stretch. And I know they're trying to increase that number. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you again so much to our presenters. I want to leave everyone with this info slide with some of our contact information. If you have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Here you also have access to some of the links that MAPC shared throughout their presentation, as well as NMCOG's website and some of the resources that we have available there. So thank you all again, and thank you to our wonderful audience. I'll be sure that everyone has access to the recording of this workshop, as well as the slides and all the resources, and I'll be following up soon. Thank you again.